Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today to discuss the emerging trend of building performance standards. My name is Mandy McVeigh, and I'm a partner in the Construction Law Group in Venables, Washington, D.C. office. My practice focuses on providing boots-on-the-ground construction legal services to owners when they are planning and executing construction. I've done a lot of new construction and also spent time supporting major renovations and retrofit projects. With respect to building performance standards, I've become interested in this new and emerging area of law since moving to the DC area in 2017. Since then, the jurisdictions where I live and work have enacted building performance standards. First, where I work, DC's BEPS was created to help meet the energy and climate goals in the Sustainable DC Plan. DC's goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption by 50% by 2032 and become carbon neutral by 2050. BEPS is also relevant where I live. I live in Bethesda, Maryland, which is located in Montgomery County, Maryland. Both the county and the state enacted BEPS in April 2022. As a construction lawyer in the area, I have a strong interest in this topic, and I'm currently serving on the Montgomery County, Maryland Building Performance Improvement Board, a 15-member board created to advise on the implementation of the building performance standards in Montgomery County. That's a little bit about me, but I'm not alone today. And Hillary, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your practice.
Thanks, Mandy. Hi, everyone. I am Hillary Atstrott-Hamburg, a partner in Venables New York Real Estate Group. I am particularly interested in this topic because New York City has implemented Local Law 97, which has a major impact on how buildings must operate in order to comply with greenhouse gas emissions standards here in New York. And this has a wide range of effects on New York City owners, landlords, tenants, construction professionals, etc. So we will be talking specifically about Local Law 97 later in this presentation.
So our agenda today, what we're going to cover, starts with a bit of background and context. Why are we talking about BEPS? Because as both Hillary and I have introduced, it's an emerging area of policy and regulation that is relevant to both construction and the real estate sector. We will discuss the trends happening at the state, federal, and local level, which serve as the catalyst for the enactment of building performance standards. We'll also provide some information about the major features of the BEPS laws and regulations that have been enacted already, and discuss the state of play, including where BEPS are going to be enacted in the future. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail, specifically, as Hillary mentioned, about New York, as well as DC and Maryland. We'll also discuss what to do to be proactive in complying with BEPS, some of the challenges and takeaways. And at the end, there is a list of resources and references for further information. Before we get started, there are a few administrative matters. First, there is a Q&A feature that you can use to provide questions. Time permitting, we will address questions at the end of the webinar, and you're also welcome to email us after the webinar at any time about any questions that you have. We've also applied for CLE credit for today's webinar, and we'll provide the CLE code later, so stay tuned for that special code. And finally, you'll receive a survey after the webinar. BEPS is a big topic in and of itself, and it's also part of the broader trend across the country to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase energy efficiency, and achieve carbon reduction targets in the short, medium, and long term. We are planning future webinars and would appreciate knowing any specific areas of interest. In order to reduce annual global greenhouse emissions in any U.S. jurisdiction, buildings have to be part of the conversation. The energy use in buildings account for the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions in most cities and is a significant source of air pollution. New buildings, once construction is completed, have a long lifespan of 30 to 50 years. Buildings are a long-term investment. While 2050 is 26 years from now, in terms of the life cycle of a building, it means that 80% of the buildings that will be in existence in 2050 are already built. So reducing emissions from the built environment is material to greenhouse gas reduction, and the existing building stock cannot be ignored. Stated another way, we can't focus all of our attention on carbon emissions from new buildings and new construction. This chart from Architecture 2030 shows the current state of total annual global carbon dioxide emissions from operating buildings that are already constructed. The built environment is responsible for approximately 35% of the global CO2 emissions. The chart further breaks down the built environment into building operations and materials, and the bigger chunk of those two is building operations. Many jurisdictions in the United States have made carbon reduction commitments. Next, we'll turn to talking about state, federal, and local level, because there is action happening at all three levels. First, we'll start at the federal level. In December 2022, the Biden-Harris administration announced the first ever federal building performance standards. This standard requires agencies to cut energy use and electrify equipment and appliances to achieve zero Scope 1 emissions in 30% of the building space owned by the federal government by 2030. This is an ambitious goal, and the Federal Building Performance Standard is an important policy tool. Federal buildings are a major source of the United States government's direct greenhouse gas emissions. The federal government is the US's single largest energy consumer and building manager. Energy used in federal buildings for space heating, water heating, cooking, and other needs account for over 25% of federal emissions. By adopting the Federal Building Performance Standard, federal agencies will be buying heat pumps, electrical water heaters, and other energy efficiency and building system technologies to reach their interim 2030 emissions reduction goal and net zero emissions by 2045. The federal government is not alone in adopting interim carbon reduction targets and net zero goals. They're also not alone in trying to lead by example. Launched in 2017, the United States Climate Alliance is a bipartisan coalition of state governors who have publicly committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and advancing state-led climate action. The dark navy shaded areas on this graphic show the states who are members of the U.S. Climate Alliance. There are 24 governors that are participating in this coalition. And what the coalition has committed to do, they've committed to 4 things. The first commitment is reducing collective net greenhouse gas emissions at least 26% by 2025 and 50% by 2030, and collectively achieving overall net zero emissions as soon as practicable, but no later than 2050. The second commitment is accelerating new and existing policies to reduce greenhouse gas pollution, building resilience to the impacts of climate change, and promoting clean energy deployment. The third commitment is centering equity, environmental justice, and just economic transition in their efforts to achieve the climate goals and create high-quality jobs. And the fourth commitment as a part of this alliance is tracking and reporting progress at periodic intervals. Currently, the states that have established economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions targets represent 60% of the economy and 55% of the US population. Separate from the Climate Alliance, some states have made carbon reduction commitments through legislative or other executive action. There's a lot of overlap between the states listed on this side and the previous slide. That said, there are 5 states that have made a carbon reduction commitment that are not members of the United States Climate Alliance. Those states are highlighted in yellow on the timeline. While this timeline illustrates that the states differ on the details of the percentage reduction and their timeline for emissions reductions, there is some consistency. Some of the themes from the chart are that the majority of states have broken down the net zero goal to include short-term, medium-term, and long-term emission reduction targets. And the state goals are to be at a midpoint in their carbon reduction journey, meaning somewhere between 40 to 50% reduction within the next decade. The longer term commitment that states have made by 2045 to 2050 fall into the deep decarbonization or net zero arena. Now let's look at the defining features of building performance standards. BEPS are an innovative new policy approach for building efficiency and decarbonization. A building performance standard is a policy that sets a specific deadline or more than one deadline for existing public and private buildings over a certain size to achieve quantified standards of performance. Building performance standards are a powerful policy tool available to drive improved building performance. The metrics included in BEPS may be one or more of energy use, water use, and/or greenhouse gas emissions. The standard becomes more ambitious over time, driving continuous long-term improvement in the existing building stock. These programs typically include a benchmarking period, and then the covered building has several years to reduce emissions to meet the identified minimum threshold performance. Building performance standards complement traditional energy code approaches, but work quite differently. And we've included some of those differences in this slide to compare and contrast the key features of BEPS versus building energy codes. First, the scope is different. BEPS applies to all existing buildings of a specified size and type within a jurisdiction. BEPS requires improvement across a wide range of buildings and yields deep retrofits at scale. It also drives private value and creates investment in private buildings. This differs significantly from building energy codes, which only apply to new construction, renovation, or equipment replacement activities. Also, BEPS are locally tailored to the performance and needs of existing buildings within a jurisdiction. The targets are informed by local benchmarking data or other regionally appropriate information. There can also be differences in BEPS across jurisdictions to align with the jurisdiction's climate goals and community priorities. Second, the timing and triggers are different. BEPS laws and regulations are based on performance metrics and contain a schedule of specific, date-certain, mandatory deadlines. Most BEPS set both long-term and interim targets for improved performance outcomes. This sets out a pathway that encourages early action while also providing a long time horizon to make informed investment decisions for equipment replacement and capital improvements to the building. BEPS provides flexibility and immediate action and sends long-term market signal. It's in contrast to code compliance requirements that are generally triggered by an application for a permit to perform either new construction, renovation, or major equipment replacement. Third, the method of measurement regarding compliance is different between BEPS and energy codes. BEPS are outcome-based policies that evaluate compliance on measured real-world performance. Greenhouse gas emissions, in that instance, the outcome measured for BEPS is either energy used or greenhouse gas emissions produced. But in the case of energy codes, compliance is evaluated on prescriptive requirements that are included in the design documents or comparing modeled performance to a modeled baseline. Another key element is BEPS applies to the whole building, and the requirements change over time to require continuous improvement, while building energy codes are more granular and specify requirements for individual elements at the time of permitting or occupancy only. Finally, BEPS impose financial consequences for non-compliance for buildings that do not meet the required performance targets by the deadline. If a building misses an interim or final performance standard, its owner must submit an alternative payment, fine, or penalty of some sort. For energy codes, if your plans and construction don't comply with the code, then you won't be issued a building permit, a certificate of occupancy, or a code compliance certificate. It's important to note that BEPS are intended to be flexible and equitable by providing options for compliance. Building owners seeking flexibility may propose a detailed building performance plan to create customized requirements. The rules for such a plan are jurisdiction specific And if it's approved, it's a binding agreement between the building owner and the jurisdiction. So just to give an example of the decrease over time and what a building owner may do, this graphic shows a hypothetical building and how they may be able to comply with BEPS by performing various upgrades over time. After, like this first lighting upgrade listed at the top left is performed, it would decrease and then kind of level out until further projects were undertaken. In this example, the building tackled the less invasive upgrades first before planning envelope and mechanical upgrades. The jurisdictions that have enacted BEPS have used a robust stakeholder engagement process in order to meet the community needs. And here we've just listed some of the considerations that have been evaluated as a part of that process. This slide shows the jurisdictions that have already adopted BEPS policies, and the slide shows them spread out over the map, but the timing of these, the first jurisdiction was Washington, D.C. to enact it in 2018, and then the jurisdictions shown on there have enacted in the intervening time, and currently there are 13 state and local jurisdictions that have already enacted building performance standards to date. And there are more to come because there is a coalition of state and local jurisdictions that have committed to enact BEPS. In January 2022, the Biden-Harris administration launched a coalition, and this slide shows all of the members of that first-of-a-kind partnership. There are 33 state and local governments representing nearly 20% of the nation's building footprint. And they undertook, the commitment was to move towards or enact BEPS on or before Earth Day 2024. And that day is right around the corner. Earth Day this year is April 22nd. So these navy blue dots with the blue shading represent jurisdictions that have committed to the passage of BEPS policy. The green dots are the jurisdictions that have already enacted it. So this map does overlap with the U.S. Climate Alliance that we talked about. And many local jurisdictions that are shown here are located in states that have also made a commitment at the state level. That said, one thing that is noteworthy, there are 3 states on this map that have not made any sort of commitment at the state level, but as a local jurisdiction are pursuing BEPS. And those are Atlanta in Georgia and Columbus in Ohio and the St. Louis and Kansas City in Missouri. Those are instances where local jurisdictions are taking action where at the state level there has not been a similar commitment. While the jurisdictions that have committed to enacting BEPS are important, in terms of explaining the emerging trend and what comes next, this map shows the broader number of jurisdictions that have policies in place for benchmarking and transparency. The blue and green dots represent jurisdictions that currently require benchmarking for public and commercial buildings, and the orange and purple dots represent jurisdictions that require benchmarking for public, commercial, and multifamily. So that's the color coding here. There is some overlap and redundancy in this chart from the previous ones, but also there are some local jurisdictions that have not been discussed in any of the previous charts. And that includes Salt Lake City, Utah, Austin, Texas, Des Moines, Iowa, and Indianapolis, Indiana. And benchmarking is an important first step. You have to measure buildings' energy use and then compare it to the energy use of similar buildings, the building's own historical energy use or reference performance level. This data is the foundation for improved building energy performance. So measuring and assessing via benchmarking is an important initial step. And the transparency refers to making the energy data public. And when it's visible to the marketplace, it creates an important incentive for improved performance. This is the last map. And this is one that is a little bit of a crystal ball that might shine a light on the future additional jurisdictions that may be adopting benchmarking and building performance standards. As of February 2022, 35 of the 50 largest cities in the US by population had adopted local climate action plans. This map shows additional jurisdictions that are either starting or continuing on their emissions reduction journey as a result of federal funds available through the Inflation Reduction Act. Because of this new program, more than 96% of the United States will be covered by a plan to reduce climate pollution. This is the US EPA Climate Pollution Reduction Grants Program, which provides $5 billion in grants to states, local governments, tribes, and territories to develop and implement plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This grant program was authorized under the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. It's a two-phase program that provides $250 million in planning grants for jurisdictions to develop strategies to reduce their climate pollution. If you think that's a lot of funding, the second phase is approximately $4.6 billion for competitive implementation grants. Each state and large metropolitan area was eligible to request allocation. The yellow in this slide shows that 45 states took part in the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. Only 5 states did not participate, which are the gray ones. The state allocation is available for large metropolitan areas to apply, and the green areas show the local jurisdictions. The second phase is for EPA to distribute the larger $4.6 billion as to advance projects that are described in their climate action plans. So with that, let's turn to some of the specifics about the details in a few of the jurisdictions that have already adopted and implemented BEPS. And DC and New York are two of the first. In DC, buildings account for 74% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions. In New York, buildings account for 67%. Both cities had been leaders in green building and climate and energy policy, and both cities rank high in the list of cities with the most Energy Star and LEED certified buildings. So it's no surprise that in 2018 and 2019, DC and New York took the bold steps to address building performance standards. While there are some similarities, there are some differences, and Hillary is going to give us a crash course on Local Law 97.
Thanks, Mandy. And before I get started, for those of you that need CLE credit today, the code is Performance 2024. So that's Performance 2024. So now to get to the good stuff with Local Law 97. What is Local Law 97? It was passed before the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019, and it was then and still is a groundbreaking law requiring buildings in New York City to dramatically reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by certain compliance deadlines. The first period of compliance is 2024 to 2029. The second period begins in 2030, and it will result in a dramatic reduction by 2050. Just a note about the evolution of Local Law 97. It was passed under a prior mayoral administration, the de Blasio administration. We are now under a new mayor, Mayor Eric Adams, and obviously a lot has changed in New York City because of the pandemic over the past several years. And so there has been an evolution in the law since it was originally drafted. And we're going to be going through some of those changes that have occurred throughout the presentation today. And what's also very interesting about this law is that it puts the burden on building owners to report their compliance. And what's interesting about that is not only are there penalties for failure to comply with these new GHG standards, but there's also penalties for failure to report, which we will also get into in the coming slides. And Mandy, we can go to the next one. So who is impacted by Local Law 97? Really, any user of commercial real estate and even some forms of residential real estate are impacted by Local Law 97. Yes, the burden is on the owners, and the owner has to pay the violations if they are not in compliance. But there are ways that those violations and those costs can be passed along to tenants. So really, users of real estate are impacted. Specifically, the types of buildings that are impacted are buildings that exceed 25,000 gross square feet, which in New York City is a lot of buildings. When there are multiple buildings on the same tax lot that together exceed 50,000 gross square feet, and multiple buildings held as condominiums that together exceed 50,000 gross square feet. There are some classifications of real estate that either are excluded completely or have reduced standards. Buildings that are exempt from Local Law 97 include dwellings of less than 3 stories, so single family or 1 and 2 family homes, industrial buildings such as utility generating substations, detached or semi-detached buildings of 3 stories or less that have their own HVAC and hot water systems. This is largely garden style apartments that you sometimes find in the outer boroughs. So again, the city trying to create some carve outs for individual residential owners who might not have the resources to comply with Local Law 97. Then there are additional buildings that are have reduced compliance requirements. And these include rent-regulated buildings, hospitals, and houses of worship. I'll note that houses of worship are a very unique classification because some are completely exempt. Others have reduced compliance standards. It really depends if it's a standalone church or if it's part of a religious campus that has other types of buildings on it. So know that if you have a house of worship that you're dealing with, it's really great to talk to an expert who is familiar with this law to make sure you're falling into the right bucket. Next slide, please. So a very important question. How do you know that your building is impacted by Local Law 97? While the law is complicated, the city has made it quite easy to identify if you are one of the buildings that meet that criteria. There is an official covered buildings list that is available at this link. And I will note, you've got to give it some time to load. It does take a few minutes because it includes tens of thousands of blocks and lots in New York City. So be patient with it, but you can check if your building is listed either by the block and lot, the building identification number. I do not recommend using your address to check if you are on this list, because if you are a real estate owner in New York, you know that your building might have multiple addresses depending on what street frontage you're looking at. And if you type in the wrong address that isn't on the list because they only do 1 per building, you could think you're excluded when you're actually included. So as a practical point, if you just want to take a look at this list, make sure you're using your block and lot number rather than your address. Important note again about the covered building list. You might be listed on this and think you are exempt, or you might be excluded from this, but think that you should have to comply. There is an appeals process with the Department of Buildings to be removed from the list. Next slide, please. So I know this might seem obvious, but where does Local Law 97 apply? It applies exclusively in the 5 boroughs of New York City. If you are a property owner on Long Island, it does not apply to you. If you're a property owner in upstate New York, it does not apply for you. That is not to say that there are not building emissions requirements in New York State. As Mandy mentioned, New York State does have emissions goals. They have signed on. And there's a separate state law, the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, that is in place that is outside of the scope of this presentation. But please do know that if you're outside of New York City, you still do have compliance requirements, just not with Local Law 97. Next slide. So when are these compliance periods and when do the limits change? Again, the goal is for a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2024 through 2050, trying to get to that net zero number. And the way the city is implementing this is by essentially having staggered compliance deadlines that create more stringent standards as we approach 2050. So the building compliance, it starts now. We are in the first reporting period. It started on January 1st, 2024, and the building owners must file the first report by May 1st, 2025, and then yearly thereafter. Now, there's some really good news for owners. Most buildings in New York City comply with the 2024 to 2029 reduction standards. It's only about 11% of buildings within the city that are not in compliance for this first period. And most of them, if they're not in compliance, it's just by a bit. The penalties will be a few $1,000s. It's very rare that you'll find a building with hundreds of thousands of dollars of penalties. Now, if you do find yourself being in that 11% of owners who are not in compliance right now, there is a new provision of the law that was added post-COVID that allows for what is known as good faith effort to comply. And we're going to get into that in a few more slides, but it is very helpful and brings that 11% even further down. If you still don't comply, even after trying to fall into this good faith effort exemption, you can purchase renewable energy credits rather than complying. More stringent standards are going to come into effect in 2030 to 2034, and then even more stringent standards from 2034 to 2050. 2030 is really going to be the point in time where we see that the majority of buildings in New York don't comply in their current condition. So we're really looking at a period from right now through 2030 where building owners need to act. Next slide, please. So how are these annual building emissions calculated? It's a complicated formula with different coefficients depending on your building type, and I've done hour-long presentations on that. So for this, I just want to give everyone the quick and dirty formula so you're generally familiar with it. It's the sum of emissions for on-site fuel consumption plus emissions from electricity produced off-site plus emissions from district energy. So again, there are calculators that are available online. We've included them in some resources that are at the end of this presentation, but that's the general formula. It's really looking at the totality of emissions from your building. What are the penalties if you fail to comply? So if a building is not in compliance based on the energy usage, it is the difference in permitted versus actual emissions multiplied by $268. So it can be for a 100,000, 200,000, million square foot building, a really substantial penalty if you are not in compliance. And where the square footage of your building becomes even more important is if you're an owner and you just fail to file your report every year. Even if you're in compliance and you fail to file a report, your penalty is going to be 50 cents per building square foot per month late. So anyone on this call who has any interest in real estate in New York needs to keep that May 1st, 2025 date in mind. You need to file the report by that day, or you're going to be hit with penalties, even if you're in compliance. Next slide, please. So let's get more in depth on the paths to compliance. as I mentioned, if you are not in compliance, you can go ahead and purchase renewable energy credits. That's permitted from 2024 through 2029. The laws in terms of renewable energy credits might shift in later periods because they're one of the most controversial topics in local law 97. And as we see new mayoral administrations, as the law evolves, we do expect changes, but you are able to purchase credits. The issue with these credits is that they must be from a tier 4 project that delivers directly into New York City. And as of right now, there are only 2 projects that meet that qualification. So we aren't sure if there are going to be more projects in the future that more owners will be able to buy credits from. So again, that's one of those continued areas where we think there might be evolution as we approach 2030. Next slide. Another way you can comply is through these good faith efforts clauses. This is, again, brand new, December 2023, it was enacted in response to the real estate community saying, you know, we still are struggling to recover from COVID. We can't go ahead and put all of these capital improvements into our property when we don't know if we're going to have to convert to a new use or if we're going to sell the building. And so the city came up with this good faith compliance mechanism, which allows for the submission of an annual report to DOB, compliance with certain benchmarking laws, and also providing DOB with a decarbonization plan by that May 1st, 2025 deadline, which will then set forth a plan to come into compliance by 2026. So good faith efforts doesn't get you all the way to 2030, but it does essentially give you an extra 2 years to figure out what you're going to do. And of course, you can always go ahead and come into compliance by doing retrofits to your building, but these are some alternative pathways if the retrofits just aren't in the cards at this juncture. Next slide, please. Mandy, I'll turn it back over to you. Mandy, you're on mute.
Thanks, Hillary. Now we're going to go through kind of a little bit of a comparing and contrasting to the jurisdictions in the DMV. So DC and Maryland State and Montgomery County that have also passed BEPS. So like New York, DC was on the early end. They passed their law in 2018, and it takes a while to then create the regulations. So the compliance regulations in DC were finalized in 2021, and they have also created a guidebook which provides specific instructions and details. So that's, while this is an emerging area of policy and regulation, jurisdictions don't have to start over or recreate the wheel. There is some information sharing and learning that can happen from the guidebooks that already exist, and DC's has been around for a while. They also updated the guidebook in February 2023, and BEPS complies with public and government buildings that are 10,000 square feet or more. So it's a lead by example, lower standard or lower size for public and government buildings. The commercial and multi-family buildings that are covered by BEPS, that starting point is 50,000 square feet. And there's kind of a tiered approach to bring in smaller buildings over time. The performance metric that DC selected is the Energy Star score. And if there is a building that cannot get an Energy Star score, they do accept an equivalent metric. And the performance target is based on the median Energy Star score for each property type located within the jurisdiction. So you're not compared with Energy Star scores of buildings that are outside DC. It is an evolving standard, so similar to what Hillary described for local law 97, that it starts and then it gets more stringent over time. New standards will be issued every 6 years. And for the compliance cycle, I'll note that as a result of COVID, because this was enacted during that time period, there is a 1-year extension. So the April reporting deadline, because April 1st is a reporting deadline for DC benchmarking, and it was extended to July 1st, 2024, kind of as a one-time extension. There are multiple compliance pathways in DC. The first compliance pathway is called the performance pathway, and a building owner meets this if it reduces the site EUI by at least 20%. And they need to use the average site EUI taken from the 2 years preceding the first compliance cycle. If the building doesn't meet that, there are other performance pathways. And the next option is the standard target pathway. And this is for a building that's already energy efficient and performing above the national median. In that instance, it may not be able to show a 20% decrease and can comply by meeting the reporting standard for the building's property type during the last year of the compliance cycle. The third pathway is alternative compliance, and a building owner may propose a plan designed to achieve energy savings comparable to the requirements in the performance pathway, and that plan has to be reviewed and approved by DC's DOEE. And then the fourth pathway is called the prescriptive pathway, and that involves owners meeting reporting milestones across 4 phases and completing agreed upon improvement measures outlined in that final plan agreement. And that needs to be signed by both DOEE and the building owner, and ultimately needs to achieve comparable energy savings to what would be required in the performance pathway. In terms of enforcement, you get a warning, there is a daily fine, and the maximum penalty are set at $10 per square foot of gross floor area, and there is a cap of $7.5 million for the enforcement penalties. The maximum penalty may be assessed if the building owner knowingly withholds information or submits inaccurate information, and doesn't submit the benchmarking report. So this isn't something that you can ignore or put your head in the sand about. That does risk maximizing the penalty. And the exemptions, there is exemptions in every jurisdiction. They have some similarities and some differences. So it's always important to read into the details. For DC, demonstrating financial distress, there's a change in ownership, vacancy, the building's going to be demolished, or other acceptable circumstances that meet the criteria in the regulation, then it can be exempt. As I mentioned, there are a phase-in approach, and so the compliance cycle start date folds in more buildings over time. For the privately owned buildings. So it starts with privately owned buildings that are 50,000 square feet or more, and eventually gets down to 10,000 square feet, which is the same threshold for government buildings in DC. In Montgomery County, Maryland, the 2 jurisdictions, they're enacting BEPS, it coincided. Neither jurisdiction has finalized the regulations yet, but draft regulations have been issued and provided for public comment. That said, the applicable regulatory process, it is possible that result in further changes. But for buildings that are located in Montgomery County, they're subject to both sets of standards and are paying close attention to the relationship and the similarities, and more importantly, the differences across the timing and the requirements for those BEPS standards. And as you'll see in the next slides, they're not identical. Maryland, the BEPS was required to be implemented by the Maryland Department of Environment as a part of the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022. And Maryland has an aggressive goal of having zero direct emissions by 2040. So BEPS, the threshold for covered buildings for Maryland state is 35,000 square feet. What's interesting about the performance metrics in Maryland is they selected both net direct emission standards and normalized site EUI standards. The first emissions standard, the interim target is a 20% reduction on or before January 1st of 2030, a 60% reduction by 2035, and net zero direct greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. The second performance standard that Maryland is using is the site EUI standard. It requires like linear progress by 2030 and 2035 on a straight trajectory basis between the baseline standard, which will be set in 2025, and the final standard. And the final EUI standard is required to be achieved by 2040. It's a 5-year cycle, starting in 2030, with the another interim in 2035 and final in 2040. The enforcement, there's based on the social cost of carbon, which what that number will be in 2030 is subject to change, but it is estimated to average $230 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And there is also EUI penalties based on pre-existing statutory authority. There are enumerated exemptions, and they look a little bit different than some of the other lists: single family homes, food service, restaurants, and parking. And then there are some enumerated circumstances that can give rise to an exemption. And what I mean by that is the building is unoccupied, financial distress. There is a list in the legislation. In Montgomery County, most buildings are already benchmarking, and the scope of the covered buildings is a little bit smaller than Maryland State, 25,000. So that means there are some buildings that will need to comply with Montgomery County BEPS that are not subject to the state BEPS. Montgomery County only chose one performance metric, and that is the normalized site EUI. And similarly, they have a trajectory approach to decrease over time to ultimately meet the end goal. It's also a 5-year cycle, so there's some consistency across BEPS in terms of that time frame, which gives owners time and the flexibility to implement different efficiency projects and plan for longer capital investments. And Montgomery County has the one interim standard, and then the final standard is 5 years later. There is a pathway if an owner does not believe that they're going to be capable to meet the standard or will be exceptionally burdened. They can go through a process of submitting an alternative compliance plan for consideration and acceptance by the county. Enforcement still to be determined by the final regulations, but there is the county does have authority to assess fines. The exemptions, similar single family homes and buildings where there is a material portion that is publicly assembly without walls, warehousing, self-storage, manufacturing and industrial, communication and utilities. Each BEPS has its own enumerated list of exemptions, so it's always important to check. And here's a chart just showing the benchmarking deadlines and the baseline years, which then the interim target is 5 years after the baseline, and final BEPS proceeds after that. So now we've kind of outlined the state of play. and also talked about that more jurisdictions are likely to enact BEPS. So hopefully we've convinced you that it's an appropriate time to take action. So what should you do if you own a building in a jurisdiction that has enacted building performance standards? It's making a plan can start now. So we did put together some steps to prepare if you are in a jurisdiction that has enacted BEPS. And I'll let Hillary jump in to address some New York specific considerations.
Thanks, Mandy. Yes, so this is a great list across jurisdictions, but something in particular that New York owners should be concerned with, especially if they're in a larger condominium or a cooperative building, whether residential or commercial, is to consider if your condominium or co-op bylaws and declaration adequately deal with, number one, the costs of any capital improvements needed to comply with local law 97, or number two, the delineation of costs amongst owners for any violations if you are not in compliance with local law 97. Many condo documents and co-op documents deal with violations that are the result of an individual unit owner's actions or inactions, but considering that this is something that really results from the collective whole, you might need to be more specific about those provisions, and now is the time to actually go through the process of making those updates.
Yeah. We also wanted to provide, in case you're in a jurisdiction that has not yet enacted it, a little bit of food for thought. If you are in a jurisdiction that's either signed on to the National Coalition or is in a jurisdiction that has made a climate action plan and they're receiving federal funding to take action, or you're one of those dots in one of our earlier slides that you've been benchmarking for a while, and then publishing that, and you want to be competitive in the marketplace, making energy efficiency improvements can assist in that. So we included resources in the back, and so that will be circulated to everybody who registered. But there's a lot, it's non-exclusive, non-exhaustive list. There is a lot, but we wanted to give you enough to get you started in each of the jurisdictions that we touched on today. Also, every jurisdiction has active and ongoing stakeholder engagement. There are public meetings. Every jurisdiction, when they enact BEPS, has put together an advisory group. Those meetings are open to the public, so you can listen in. The members are available, and you can also always reach out, and ongoing and proactive communication with the jurisdiction that is enforcing with BEPS. If you have questions, if you have concerns, like Hillary gave the good example of, is my building covered? There is a lot of technical resources available, and the goal is definitely, in the high tides, all boats rise. Like, we're all moving on this journey together. The EPA Portfolio Manager tool is benchmarking. So if you are not currently benchmarking, they have a lot of technical training and information available to get started with that. And there's a lot of resources available to answer the question of, we do want to make our building more energy efficient. So what can we do? How do we get the most bang for our buck? There are a lot of resources available to start understanding those. There's also a lot of funding available. We talked about the one program that's through the Inflation Reduction Act. There's also a lot of money through local green banks, and there is kind of a correlation to jurisdictions enacting these policies and then setting up the support to make it happen and provide equitable access for building owners to be able to access it and make these changes. The funding opportunities vary locally and state, but they are out there, and there are funds through green banks, PACE programs, and other things like that. And also reviewing, the lease terms. If you're an owner and taking advantage of opportunities that you have, either in turnover of the lease tenant to make improvements or trying to align the incentive for owners to recoup the investment and get some of the benefit of energy savings on the back end. So we only have a few minutes. We did put together some takeaways, food for thought, for owners in jurisdictions that have BEPS or will be located there soon as more jurisdictions enact it. This isn't an overnight automatic process. The key is definitely long-term planning. There are a lot of owners and buildings that are facing post-pandemic challenges. The financial costs, both for non-compliance as well as compliance, need to be considered in capital cost planning. There are also, for BEPS compliance, some governing considerations in terms of records retention. So that's something that companies should pay attention to, and also work with your operations team. One of the things that I think is interesting about BEPS is you can't tackle it in a silo, and you do have to break down and have those conversations with the technical building operations folks that know the building and equipment best in order to evaluate what is feasible to put that plan together. And there are also considerations if you're planning to transfer ownership of the building that should be taken into consideration as well. We have like 3 slides of select but non-exhaustive references in each jurisdictions. And we do appreciate your time and wanted to leave it open. And I do think we have a question in the chat. So question is, what if I have issues accessing data from my utility for benchmarking or funding? And this is an issue that was just discussed at the DOE Better Buildings Summit, and is discussed in ongoing BEPS conversations. You need whole building data to benchmark, and there is variability across jurisdiction to get that if you don't already have it and you're having trouble. I know EPA is working on an initiative with utilities to explain the importance of it for BEPS and benchmarking. And I know it's an issue that's being actively addressed, but the answer is going to vary based on jurisdiction.
Mandy, one other question on local law 97 that I think we have time to answer is, what do you see as the biggest obstacle in order for both the city and owners to achieve compliance with local law 97? I think for the city, the biggest issue is that there's just not enough staff right now to deal with all of the questions that are coming at DOB. It's one small office that I think has 6 employees, and not all of them are solely dedicated to local law 97. So that's a huge issue. And for building owners, I think it's staying on top of it and acting now. So many people are thinking, this doesn't impact me right now. I'm going to wait until 2030. And if you wait until 2030, it's going to be too late to do the retrofits necessary to comply. So really coming up with the strategy now is going to be the biggest issue, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I agree. The moving towards achieving short-term and long-term carbon reduction targets, whether it's at the individual corporate level or for purposes of progressing efficiency for BEPS, it requires longer-term thinking in a way that is unique to the real estate and construction industry.
And as a final reminder, the CLE code is Performance 2024.
Yes. Well, please fill out the survey and don't hesitate to contact Hillary or myself if you have any questions about BEPS or any other construction and real estate related topics. And have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.